Jones has spent his life working to make Alabama a better place. He was born in Fairfield in 1954 to a U.S. steelworker and a stay-at-home mom. He grew up in Alabama during a period of great change and played a critical part in helping the state and her people overcome some of their greatest challenges. His early years forged his values and a deep sense of responsibility to treat everybody with dignity and respect. As a product and lifelong resident of the state of Alabama, Senator Jones represents the best qualities of what it means to be an Alabamian. The senator grew up during the tumultuous era of the desegregation of Alabama's public schools. But from childhood, he was drawn to both leadership and to fighting for what he felt was right. He also found a love for politics and organizing. Through volunteering at the University of Alabama in a statewide campaign to modernize Alabama's court system, and as a young Democrat, the senator learned the power of one determined person to effect change. He later served as the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama, beginning in 1997. It was while serving in this position that Senator Jones successfully prosecuted 2 of the 4 men responsible for the 16th Street Church bombing, finally getting justice for 4 little girls who died in that bombing after more than 30 years. Along with taking on the Ku Klux Klan, he prosecuted terrorists like Eric Rudolph and many others who sought to use fear, hatred, and violence to inhibit the rights of others. Senator Jones took that same passion with him when he ran successfully in the 2017 special Senate election in Alabama. He understands that public service is a privilege that comes with the responsibility of making the country better for all Americans. He's committed to continuing to fight for every Alabamian in the Senate to increase affordable access to health care and to make sure that every child has access to a quality education regardless of the zip code where they live. Please join me in welcoming Senator Doug Jones.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you so much, Dr. Rudd. Thank you for having me here. It's an absolute delight for my wife, Louise, and I to be here. We have been, as you can imagine, the last 10 months or so have been a little bit busy for us. But thanks to her, my running mate, who I refer to my wife, we're still running. It's a daily grind, but it's a lot of fun for us, and I appreciate all the help. And I know I got a ton of help out of the state of Tennessee, and I appreciate everything that came my way south to Alabama so that we could prevail on December the 12th, which, as you might have heard, was our 25th wedding anniversary. So it's going to be hard to top that one, I can tell you that. I also want to mention a couple of things before I make a couple of remarks. I do want to, mention a couple of old friends who are here today. One is also a former U.S. attorney, Mike Cody. Mike is out there somewhere. I can't hardly see anybody, but Mike is one of my heroes. Mike truly is one of my heroes and has some amazing stories. And then another old friend who was on one of your panels today, who happens to be here today, Roy Austin, if any of you got to hear Roy. Roy is also an old friend. And what you may not know about Roy is when I first became the United States Attorney in 1997, Roy Austin was one of 2 lawyers out of the Department of Justice that had been assigned to work on the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing case. And for a couple of years, before I kind of took over everything as a U.S. Attorney, Roy provided the background that helped us. So please thank Roy Austin for all the work he did on getting those convictions. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that if I let go the fact that I hope I'm here with a couple of future colleagues, Mike Espy and Phil Bredesen, that I hope will join me in the Senate come next fall. We have been brought here to celebrate and honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. as we mark the 50th anniversary of his assassination. This conference provides each and every one of us an opportunity to reflect on Dr. King's legacy and what it means to each one of us. You've heard about my role in the 16th Street bombing cases. December 12th of this year was one of the highlights of my life. But I'll tell you in all candor, I don't think it compares to listening to two jury foremen announce guilty verdicts of two former Klansmen for the death of those 4 young girls. It was a remarkable journey from a kid that grew up in Fairfield all the way to the University of Alabama, and then working in the Senate and then being able to handle that, getting the support of the Attorney General of the United States, Janet Reno, and her top deputy, Eric Holder, who worked with me a lot on that case, as well as the Eric Rudolph case. It was a remarkable time. But with the guilty verdicts that we achieved in those cases, I think in many ways represents how far Alabama, the South, and our nation has come in the past 50 years. Those verdicts couldn't have happened 50 years ago. They just would have never happened. But we had a diverse jury of all ages and all men and women, black and white, that found justice finally after so many years. And in the aftermath of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, Dr. King delivered the eulogy for 3 of the girls, pointing out that their deaths say to us that we must work passionately and unrelentingly for the realization of the American dream. To me, that line contains an essential core of his legacy, confronting the challenges in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, tragedy, and setbacks. And 50 years later, his influence can be seen in all of our lives, every day. You see it in the kinds of schools our children attend, where we eat, where we gather, where we work. His influence has been immeasurable. But as we all know too well, Dr. King's dream has not been fully realized. And in many respects, it seems that we have been backsliding. We've been sliding a little back on voting rights and access to the ballot box. We've been sliding backward in the area of criminal justice reform. We seem sliding backward by empowering white supremacists and white nationalists from one end of this country to the other. Sliding backwards in so many ways of our society. But as we gather today and throughout this week, it's imperative to acknowledge that together, as a group and individually, each one of us has the responsibility to continue to fight for the American dream, to honor Dr. King's legacy by working every day to ensure that our nation lives up to its creed of dignity, respect, equality, and justice. You know, there are many great men and women who stood with Dr. King in his fight for equality and justice. These men and women in Dr. King's were standing up for what is the best of the American dream. And there have been many people that have followed, many leaders that have followed Dr. King to carry on that legacy. But I don't think anyone embodies that spirit more than my friend Eric Holder, a man who has done so much in service to the United States. His life story is truly the American dream. Born in 1951 in New York City to an immigrant father and a second-generation immigrant mother, Eric graduated from a high school for gifted students. He attended college and law school at Columbia University. In 1976, following law school, he got a job with the Department of Justice, working as part of the Attorney General's Honors Program. In 1988, he was nominated by former President Ronald Reagan to become an associate judge of the Superior Court of the District of Columbia. He presided over hundreds of civil and criminal trials. And for those of us who have been in the arena of trials, whether you're a trial lawyer or a judge, there's nothing that gives you the experience of having to handle each one of those, to appear in court, to see the pros, the cons, the good, the bad, the ugly of how justice can be meted out every day. He did such a wonderful job that Eric was then nominated by President Bill Clinton to serve as the United States Attorney for the District of Columbia in 1993. As such, he was the first African American to to hold that position. And during his 4-year term, he created domestic violence units, community prosecutions projects, and rose to the top in the Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney ranks, such that in 1997, shortly before I became the U.S. Attorney in Birmingham, he became the first African American selected to the position of Deputy Attorney General of the United States, the number 2 person in the Department of Justice. With doing that, he became the highest ranking African American in law enforcement in the history of the United States. But he didn't stop there. After Barack Obama's election, he was appointed and confirmed as the 82nd United States Attorney General in 2009, making him the first African American Attorney General in history. Eric's tenure was marked by successful efforts in advancing civil rights issues like voting rights, racial profiling. He led an investigation into the police department in Ferguson, Missouri, and other police departments who had let their guard down when it came to protecting all members of society. He led efforts in criminal justice reform, knowing that mass incarceration has been jailing a generation of black men in this country. And he used his platform to call for a more open discussion about race and racial discrimination in America. I have to say that one of Eric's proudest moments, and we did work closely, but one of his highest achievements was marrying an Alabama girl. Sharon, his wife Sharon, who could not make it today, and for those of you that do not know this, Sharon Malone Holders from Mobile, Alabama. Her sister, Vivian, was one of the 2 kids blocked at the stand in the schoolhouse door by Governor George Wallace in 1963. So Sharon, like Eric, has a history with the civil rights movement. So before I turn it over to the Attorney General, I'd like to leave you with one last quote from Dr. King's eulogy to those 4 girls killed in the church bombing as we reflect on his life and legacy. He said, "Death is not a period that ends the great sentence of life, but a comma that punctuates it to a more lofty significance." My great friend Eric Holder has worked tirelessly to continue the work of Dr. King, to do all that he can following the comma that marked Dr. King's death. And in so doing so, he has not only carried on the legacy of Dr. King, he established a historic legacy of his own. We should all inspire to reach the lofty significance and goals and the mountaintop like these 2 great men have. It is with a great pleasure that I present to you my friend, the 82nd Attorney General of the United States, the Honorable Eric Holder.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank Dean Rudd, Dean Letzo, President Freeman for inviting me here today. Louise, it's always good to see you, and you bring Doug with you. It's always good to see you, Louise, But thank you, Senator Doug Jones, for your kind words and warm welcome, but also for your service to our country. Now, as a person who's worked with you for over 20 years, I know the depth of your commitment and the extent of your achievements. You have too often been a lonely voice in the fight for justice, but you've always prevailed in courtrooms and at ballot boxes. Yours is now a welcome presence in Washington, D.C. at this trying time for our nation. I'm proud to call you a good colleague and a treasured friend. It is a privilege to be with you all today with so many distinguished faculty members, elected officials, committed activists, as well as future leaders. And as always, it's good to be here in Memphis. Now, I love this city. I love its energy. I love its sense of possibility. The feeling that, as Dr. King once described it, that something is happening in Memphis. Now, I also deeply admire this city's ability to showcase its extraordinary progress without glossing over a heart-rending past. Now, like so much of our nation, Memphis has been defined by great achievement, but also by great tragedy. From the brave Memphis State 8, the first African-American students to set foot on what was then the Memphis State campus in 1959, to last year's successful Take 'em Down 901 initiative that toppled two long standing Confederate memorials. The city's forward movement, I think, is evident. Its healing is evident. And yet, the scars of our past can still be seen and felt, not only in this city, but in our nation as well. Now, today we gather to commemorate the deepest of wounds, the passing of a man, but not the death of a dream, the senseless murder of our nation's most committed, most courageous, and most consequential drum major for justice, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. But on this day, we must also commit ourselves to making real the dream that animated his too short life. Now, for half a century now, the anniversaries of Dr. King's birth and death have provided important opportunities not only to celebrate and reflect upon his extraordinary life, but to consider where we now are as a nation, to take stock of our progress, to take responsibility for the work that remains before us, and to rededicate ourselves to the dream of racial, social, and economic justice that is Dr. King's living legacy. But we must also confront the truth about him. In his life, Dr. King forced America to face what he termed the three evils: racism, poverty, and war. Though revered now, that singular focus on those evils ultimately made him an unpopular figure. This is truth. By 1966, a Gallup poll found that almost two-thirds of Americans had an unfavorable opinion of Dr. King. As he emphasized his opposition to war and spread the focus of his work outside the South, he became a threatening, polarizing, and disliked figure. Now, I was too young to realize when I first heard of his assassination in that moment of grief and heartbreak how powerfully his spirit would live on. I did not yet understand that no act of violence or hate, nor any temporal disfavor, was strong enough to hold back the movement that Dr. King had launched, or deny the dream American Attorney General and the election of our nation's first African-American president. We would not have had the opportunity to serve in those positions without the sacrifices and the vision of Dr. King. And I wish that Dr. King could be with us here so that he could see how the new country that he helped to create has improved so much. I wish he could see how the system of American apartheid that he fought against has been legally dismantled. I wish he could see how people of all races treasure the memorial that stands in his honor at our National Mall. Above all, though, I wish he could see how effectively concerned women, LGBTQ Americans, still distressed minority communities, and now students and citizens who have seen enough of gun violence have copied Dr. King's tactics, and how in acts of King-inspired nonviolent protest, they have launched their own movements, calling for and marching for fairness, opportunity, and justice. Now, despite the extraordinary progress that has shaped the last 5 decades and transformed our entire society, we're still marching. We are still striving. And we're still calling on our nation's leaders to act with a sense of justice, compassion, and common humanity. Because the unfortunate fact is that in 2018, America's long struggle to overcome injustice, to eliminate disparities, and to eradicate violence has not yet ended. And the age of bullies and bigots is not fully behind us. Bull Connor and Jim Clark are gone, but parts of their legacy endure. In my travels across this great nation, I often hear from people, especially young people, who tell me that they feel lost in their own country, unsure of where they belong, and fearful that America's too long-standing divisions are threatening to tear our nation apart. This is indeed a time of challenge and of consequence. But Dr. King was no stranger to such moments throughout his life, and most famously on the eve of his death as he delivered the seminal mountaintop speech that would be his final sermon. Reverend King asked himself when, if given the choice of any period in time, he would choose to be alive. Now, the question began with a journey through the ages, and at each stop, whether Mount Olympus or ancient Rome, Lincoln's signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, or Roosevelt's call to fear only fear itself, Dr. King asked himself, what era would he choose to experience and to help shape? And his own, he ultimately decided. Happiness, he explained, comes from embracing the blessings and burdens of destiny and the opportunities that arise in difficult times. Only when it is dark enough, Dr. King said, can you see the stars. Well, today, once again, it is dark enough. We have not yet reached the promised land, but today, once more, we can see the stars. We see them in the courage and commitment of ordinary people nationwide, Americans of all ages, races, and backgrounds, who refuse to give in to fear and frustration, who resist shameful attempts to exploit and to divide the American people, and who are keeping up the fight for the safety and civil rights of all. We see them in people who take to the streets and to the offices of their elected leaders. We see them in the examples of those who, in recent weeks, in the wake of senseless tragedy, have found their voices in calling for solutions that respect our forebears, our law enforcement community, and our legal system, while prioritizing our most precious resource, our children. It is times like these when the power of Dr. King's example and his enduring words are brought into stark focus. And one of the most important lessons he left is that it is necessary to be indignant and to be impatient so that it impels us to take action. The fact that Dr. King's strength was rooted in frustration, just as much as in faith, is really a great comfort to me. Now, I say that because as proud as I am of our country, my country, and as grateful as I feel for the progress that we've made and the opportunities that the civil rights movement has made available to me, the truth is, like Dr. King, I am dissatisfied. I am dissatisfied that every day in America, 46 children and teenagers are shot. I am dissatisfied that in our nation's lowest income neighborhoods, only 4% of black children have a father at home, and that 1 in 5 of the black boys born in these neighborhoods end up in our criminal justice system. I am dissatisfied that economic progress remains uneven, that educational opportunity is far from uniform, and that in the face of these facts, simply acknowledging that black lives matter too is somehow controversial. I'm dissatisfied that I've had to have the talk with my then teenage son, the conversation that so many black families in America have had in order to protect their children about how to safely interact with law enforcement. But as the brother of a retired police officer, and as someone who was Doug, who spent his career working hand in hand with the women and men in law enforcement, I'm also dissatisfied that unpunished bad actions by a few have sown widespread mistrust for the dedicated, honorable men and women who wear the badge. I'm also dissatisfied that too many women, Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans, lesbian, gay, and transgender Americans, and people with disabilities still yearn for equal opportunity and fair treatment. And I am dissatisfied that more than half a century after Dr. King helped to pass the landmark Voting Rights Act of 1965, far too many Americans find it hard to get the right to vote and the assurance that one's vote is counted fairly. All of this remains under siege. To me, this question of voting is the chief civil rights issue of our time. And in that regard, and what's striking is that in that regard, our nation is not as different as it should be from the America that existed during the life of Dr. King. The Selma March was about the right to vote. The deaths of 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi in 1964 was about the right to vote. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 has justifiably been called the crown jewel of the civil rights movement. As Dr. King so often pointed out in this great country, the ability of all eligible citizens to participate in and to have an equal voice in the work of government is not a privilege, it is a right. The ability to vote is not a privilege, it is a right. And as Lyndon Johnson said, as President Johnson said, and I quote, "The vote is the most powerful instrument ever devised by man for breaking down injustice," unquote. Our nation's policies are determined by those who serve in elected office, and we must make certain that these representatives accurately reflect the choices of the American electorate. Yet in many communities today, our political system is far from fair. It's been undermined by spurious and outright false claims of widespread voter fraud and by acts of voter suppression. And it's been rigged by racial and partisan gerrymandering. And that's why I helped to launch and am proud to chair the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. Now, the NDRC is working to make our democracy more representative, and we're attacking this problem from every angle. We're working to rebuild a system where citizens choose their representatives and dismantle an unjust status quo where politicians are picking their voters. We're working to ensure that voting maps are drawn fairly and that the integrity of the Voting Rights Act is upheld. We're working to erase laws that make the casting of a ballot a function of your age, your ethnicity, or your party, and not your connection to this nation. And we need your help. Now, but joining this fight is just one of the many ways that you can honor Dr. King's legacy and help to shape America's future. It is time for each of us, and it's time for everybody, to ask, as Dr. King so famously did, where do we go from here? What more can we do as individuals and as a society to help realize Dr. King's vision of racial and social equality? How can we lift up the values that were at the heart of his sermons, the root of his actions, the core of his character, and the center of his life? Most importantly, how can we heal this divided nation, as he sought to do, and bring our fellow citizens together in the name of tolerance, nonviolence, compassion, love, and above all, justice? It is only by coming together that we can write the next great chapter of America's story. You know, Dr. King is often quoted as saying that the arc of the moral universe is long, and it bends towards justice. Well, that's true, but it's only because caring, committed people put their hands on that arc and pull it towards justice. And so it must be again. So today, let us not merely reflect upon our past. Let's pledge our best efforts to protect the advances that we have inherited and make real the legacy that's been entrusted to each of us. That is our charge. And this is our moment. As easy as it is, we must not look back toward a past that was comforting to too few and unjust to too many. That is not how we make America great. We must do the difficult things, and that means embracing the uncertainties of the future and then shape that future in the way that truly great American leaders always have. We must not give in to irrational fear and manufactured division, but instead embrace needed trust and national unity. So let us rise to the challenge of our time. And in the spirit of Dr. King, let us signal to the world that in America today, the pursuit of a more perfect union lives on, the march toward the promised land goes on, and the belief not only that we shall overcome, but that we will truly come together as one nation continues to push us forward. May God continue to bless our journey. May God continue to bless this wonderful city, and may God continue to bless the United States of America. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I have been given some questions here, I guess, that have been taken from folks in the audience, and brave person that I am, I've decided I'll try to give these a go. Okay, we've got a lot of them. Okay. So I get to choose which ones maybe I want to answer then. One question says, how confident are you that the movement started by the Parkland, Florida students will be successful in moving various leadership to where they feel the country should be in regards to gun control specifically? Well, I think that's a very interesting question. I'm actually, I don't know if you all watched, I was on the Bill Maher show, I guess 2 weeks or so ago, with two of the young people from Parkland. And I was struck by how precocious they almost are, by the presence that they have, by their ability to convey in a very sincere and effective way the feelings that they have. I think that I think these young people, these kids, I think are going to be successful in ways that we adults have not. My concern is that we not have a moment, but that we have a movement. And I think that they are committed, and I think the question will be who among us will join with them in this fight for just sane gun control laws. And so as I think, as I said in my remarks, as if we want to honor Dr. King's legacy, I think we should all find an issue, a cause that we identify ourselves with, and working with these young people in Parkland, but these young people really all around the country, is a place where I think we as adults could justifiably spend a good portion of our time. Next question. How does the work of Dr. King continue to impact your vision for the country today and the work that you do? Well, I think that, Dr. King's words are timeless. 1968 is 50 years ago. It seems like only an instant to me in some ways. And yet, what he said during the 50s and what he did in the 50s and 60s is as relevant today as it was then. And I think it certainly had an impact on me as a young man. It certainly helped shape my view of what I should do as a public servant. It impacts me today as just a citizen of the United States. And that's what all of you are, citizens who have enormous amounts of power. I don't think that we should allow ourselves to live in a society where we think, we simply vote, which is important, which is extremely important, and then we leave to our elected officials the running of this country. As American citizens, we have a responsibility, a duty, and we have the power to shape the nation that we live in and the policies that this nation takes. If you remember, after the inauguration of President Trump, the march the day after, that Women's March, and how powerful that was. And remember how powerful it was to see citizens going into offices of congressmen and senators as consideration was being given to dismantling Obamacare. That showed real citizen power. And this last march that we saw in Washington, that Young People's March, again, shows citizen power. And from that citizen power, I think, can come meaningful change. And so it's not only a question of how my life has been impacted by Dr. King and my commitment to certain things. The question is, how has it impacted your lives and the commitments that you're going to make to making this nation better and more just? You do have that power, and I do think that as American citizens, you also have that responsibility. Let's see. Yeah, okay, I'm not going to do that one. Okay. Facebook, we don't want to talk about Facebook. Okay. Okay. All right, this is interesting. How do you feel you changed the narrative for African Americans? I think I have to be pretty humble here because I think that I'm proud of the work that I did with President Obama, and I think we made a positive contribution, but the work that we did standing on the shoulders of giants, people who came before us, some of whom are well known to us, Dr. King, John Lewis, Coretta Scott King, as I mentioned, but many of whom are unknown to us, people who did seemingly small things but really significant things, people who labored too long in fields, people who suffered through Jim Crow, people who, I think about my father, who enlisted in the United States Army at the age of 41, 42 during World War II, and while in uniform was discriminated against. He's born and raised in Barbados, came to New York, then went south for the first time in uniform, and was discriminated against in North Carolina and then out in Oklahoma. And I think about the love that that man had for this country, and how that love for this country and the little things that he did had an impact on the narrative for African Americans. So I think about them. I think about what President Obama and I attempted to do, what Doug Jones did, and how he impacted that narrative. But again, I get back to, what are you all going to do? What are you going to do to impact not only the narrative for African Americans, but for all Americans? What are you going to do to make sure that this country lives up to its founding documents? The possibility for positive change is there, but it is not promised. Positive change doesn't happen simply because of the turning of the calendar. It happens because people commit themselves, people persevere when there are bad times, people work with other people. We have that capacity within ourselves to make that narrative for all Americans better. So I'd like to think that I helped to have an impact on the narrative for African Americans and maybe all Americans. But as I said, I stand on the shoulders of people far greater than me. I want to thank you all so much for your hospitality. I look forward to working with all of you in some form or fashion as concerned citizens in making this country better. And we can do that. We can do that. We should be optimistic about our future. Think about those young people who marched just last week. Think of the women who came out, as I said, after the inauguration. There are hundreds of millions of us who care about this nation. It means we've got to vote, it means we've got to work. But if we stay together, if we stay committed, we can make positive change a reality for this great nation. And I look forward, as I said, to working with all of you in that quest. Thanks very much.
At the beginning of the luncheon, I promised a program that would be fitting for such an historic and extraordinary occasion as this one for our city, state, and nation. And I think you'll agree that Mr. Holder's remarks met that very high standard. So thank you again, Mr. Holder. I'd also like to mention the Attorney General didn't just come here and meet with you all today, but at our invitation, he went to the law school this morning and met with 40 or 50 of our students in a very informal session. And his remarks here and his remarks there, I think, again, very similar remarks, but the interaction with our students, I think, was extremely meaningful, and his guidance to them as to the impact they can have in the future and the inspirational words that he left with them. I'm personally grateful for those remarks as well, so thank you very much, Attorney General, for doing that. Also, I'll do that. Also, I'd like to thank once again Senator Doug Jones for being with us today.